I think as many of you know, Daniel Peril was brutally murdered while in Pakistan working as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal. A free and active press has been an essential part of our democracy since our founding. It's an invaluable window on the world around us, and as a foreign correspondent, Daniel devoted his life to seeking truth about the world we live in, and he risked and ultimately gave his life in order to bring that world home to all of us. I can't think of a more fitting person to give the 2014 Daniel Peril Lecture than Ambassador Samantha Power, someone who not only serves the United States at the highest levels, but who began her career as a dedicated foreign correspondent, like Daniel, seeking truth and justice in dark and dangerous places. Now, as our tradition at the Peril Lecture, we have a few preliminaries before Ambassador Power comes out on stage. We'll begin with some remarks from Rabbi Chaim Seidlerfeller, Executive Director of UCLA Hillel, followed by Judea Peril, Daniel's father. Following Judea Peril, Mayor Eric Garcetti, the city of Los Angeles, will give Ambassador Power a full lecture. Sorry, a full introduction. He may give a full lecture. He's been known to do it. Ambassador Power will speak for about 30 minutes. She and I will sit down in these chairs for a brief conversation, and we should have some time at the end to open it up to questions from the audience. So let me first call to the stage Rabbi Chaim Seidlerfeller.
Thank you. Ambassador Power, Mayor Garcetti, Cal, and Yehuda, and my friends. In what way can I best memorialize Danny Peril and connect his life's mission to that of Samantha Power and the United Nations? What came to mind are the bold and innovative writings of Rabbi Chaim Hershenson, born in Sfat, and self-exiled from Jerusalem to Hoboken, New Jersey, where he served as the community rabbi from 1904 until his passing in 1935. Not known at all to the Jewish public, Hershenson was a prolific writer and an audacious thinker who in the early part of the 20th century tackled difficult issues such as the role of women in Judaism and the establishment of a future Jewish and democratic state in Palestine. Eliezer Schweid, Emeritus Professor of Philosophy at the Hebrew University, dedicated a monograph to Hershenson entitled Demokratia v'Halacha, Democracy and Jewish Law. Listen carefully. In 1919, Hershenson outlined his vision of the rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And I quote, "From there shall come forth Torah and light to all the world, and this house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. For there will not be present in this house any image or symbol particular to a single nation in which another cannot believe. Inside the ark will be only the two tablets of the covenant, which are the pillar of civilization for all the nations. It is not far-fetched to think that this is the period of which Isaiah prophesied. The mount of the Lord's house shall stand from above the mountains, and to it shall flow the many peoples." And Isaiah made no mention, says Hershenson, of burnt offerings or animal sacrifices. From this house, judgment will come forth between the nations, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nations shall not take up sword against nation. They shall never again know war. Hershenson continues so poignantly. The inevitable conclusion is that the Hall of Peace will be located in this house. It will not be the Hall of Peace as in The Hague, in which the delegates of peace bowed in awe before those who instill fear in the land of the living, and the slightest accusation of injustice leveled at one of the kings of the earth is considered rebellion. It will also be more than the League of Nations, proposed by the father of national morality, the Wilson program. It will rather house the court of nations, which will judge nations with righteousness and the peoples with justice. And wickedness will no longer rule the world. And the idea that nationalism justifies wickedness and injustice will be voided. And there will be equality before the law for every nation. Every human will have the right to develop according to their nature without impairing the rights of their fellow humans. And man will not rule over man, nor nation over nation, nor nation over man, nor man over nation to their detriment. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and they shall no longer learn war. Daniel Peril, like Isaiah and Rabbi Hershenson before him, taught us to dream. Can you still allow yourselves to dream? Our dreams prod us to reach beyond. Without our dreams, we have no future.
Thank you, Rabbi. I now want to invite out Judea Peril. Before I do that, Ruth Peril, Daniel's mother, lost an earring in the lobby. If you found the earring, turn it into one of the house staff. She will greatly appreciate it. Judea Peril is an esteemed professor at UCLA of computer science. In 2011, he received the Turing Award for his groundbreaking and pioneering work on artificial intelligence. And of course, he's president and co-leader of the Daniel Peril Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Judea Peril.
Thank you, Carl, Rabbi Chaim, Mayor Garcetti, and Chancellor Block, distinguished guest, and our distinguished speaker, Ambassador Power, friends of the Daniel Peril Foundation, colleagues and students, and interns and volunteers, ladies and gentlemen. February is a difficult month for us, the Peril family. On February 21st, 2002, exactly 12 years ago, the world was stunned to learn of Daniel's murder and joined us in asking the haunting question, how can anyone harm a gentle soul like Danny? A journalist, a musician, a superhumanist, and a champion of truth, humor, and friendship. Yes, he was a superhumanist. Danny carried his laptop and violin to remote corners of the forgotten world, from war-torn towns of Kosovo and Bosnia to the poverty-stricken villages of Eritrea and Yemen. As his mama and papa, we could not quite understand what drives this young, well-groomed Angeleno from the beautiful beaches of Santa Monica to the dusty roads of Sudan and Pakistan. And how is it that in spite of all the violence and cruelty that he was seeing around him, he continued to want to believe that man is not a predator to other men, but a brother, a kindred spirit? And what made him believe that we, well-fed Americans, owe something to that forgotten world, and that to pay our debts, the least we can do is to search for the truth and listen to it? We are very glad, therefore, very happy that Ambassador Power has titled her lecture, Fighting for the Truth, which so perfectly fit the legacy of our son, Danny, as well as the mission of the Daniel Peril Foundation. It turns out that Ambassador Power was covering the war in Kosovo at about the same time that Danny did. And she has been carrying the torch of truth, compassion, and global responsibility ever since, with courage and effectiveness. In particular, on the pages of Jewish history, she will be always remembered as the one who pushed relentlessly for the full inclusion of Israel across the UN system against many forces of exclusion and isolation. Thank you, Ambassador Power, for honoring Danny's memory with your lecture tonight, and for rekindling in our heart the biblical conviction that in spite of all the violence and cruelty that we have seen in the world in the past 12 years, man is not a predator to other men, but a brother, a kindred spirit. We are deeply grateful to everyone who worked hard to make this event special, to our sponsors, Hillel and Burkle Center, and to the thousands of people who are standing with us on a daily basis in our quest for a better world. Thank you.
Thank you, Judea. So let me first say I'm really pleased to be able to introduce Mayor Eric Garcetti tonight. Not only is he the 42nd mayor of the city of LA, but he's a great friend and a great person, someone who truly understands that LA is a global city and one of the great capitals of the 21st century. Eric Garcetti was elected mayor in May of 2013. He first entered city office in 2001 as a member of the LA City Council, where he served as president of the council 4 times. Eric grew up in the San Fernando Valley, attended college and graduate school at Columbia, and was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford and LSE. A little-known fact is that Eric's most important degree is from UCLA, class of 1982 at the UCLA Elementary School. Before entering public service, Eric taught international affairs at Occidental and that other place. He polished his piano skills, which are very good. He recently performed with Moby. He served on the California Board of Human Rights Watch, and in a wonderful instance of life imitating art, while a city councilman, Eric appeared on TV as LA Mayor Ramon Quintero on the police drama The Closer. He joined and remains an officer in the U.S. Naval Reserve. Eric Garcetti has been the real mayor of LA for only a few months, but in that time, he's revamped leadership at the nation's largest municipal utility and the nation's busiest port, appointed LA's first chief technology officer, and appropriately for a city built on immigrants from every nation on earth, has opened a mayor's office for immigration affairs. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Eric Garcetti.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Cal, Chancellor, and everybody who has made this day as possible. I want to say how honored I am to be back here. 4 years ago, I introduced Christopher Hitchens, who spoke here and spoke powerfully, and each one of these lectures I know has given a real ethical impulse to the work that each of us think about and the work that we do. And it's fitting that the Peril family, Judea and Ruth, who came to visit with me as a council member many years ago, and I was so touched by their love and their determination to do something, to continue who Danny was in the present and not just the past. And his memory continues to bring us together. You should be very, very proud of what you've done. I didn't know Daniel Peril, but we grew up with some parallels. 2 Jewish kids from Encino who used to play, I think, over at Birmingham on the sports fields. Somebody who, like me, set out to see the world from this incredible platform of Los Angeles. And the things that he did to touch people's lives in his writing and continues to do through these lectures, through the Foundation's work, through the school that's named after him here in Los Angeles, show him to truly be an amazing angel here in the City of Angels. Before being elected mayor, I was a professor of international relations, so it's a great joy for me, too, to be able to introduce tonight's speaker. I used to specialize in human rights and international security and ethnic conflict, so Ambassador Power's work actually was stuff that I would put in the classroom. Life is funny. When she was writing then and when I was teaching, I think neither one of us would have imagined we'd be here today in these 2 roles. But in a city as diverse as Los Angeles, we may think sometimes that human rights happens in distant places. Indeed, Eleanor Roosevelt said it best, though, and I'll paraphrase, that where do, after all, human rights begin? Not in faraway and distant places, but in places so small they're not found on any human map. The places we work, the places we live, and here in Los Angeles, where we have more survivors of torture and genocide and asylum seekers than almost any place on the face of the earth. Los Angeles is both a reflection of the hopes and of, in some ways, the perils of human behavior. As the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations, Samantha Powers has been a clarion voice for this nation and for this world of reinjecting morality into the world of international relations. She's had a profound impact on American foreign policy, and in doing so, she continues to advance her passion of human rights and democracy, protecting religious minorities, and stopping human trafficking. My wife Amy, who's here with me, the two of us work a lot on human trafficking issues, and we thank Ambassador Powers for being such a strong voice in this role and as a member of the cabinet for President Obama. But previously in the administration as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Multilateral Affairs and Human Rights on the National Security Staff at the White House, she made sure that some of the most pressing moral issues were met by the policies that don't just do the right thing politically, but that save lives. We know that each one of us have moments in our lives where we can be called on to say the right things and even more difficult to do the right things. At a moment when there's plenty of shouting in politics, but that shouting seems to be, when we turn on the television, only about who is in power and electoral victories. We need more voices like hers because there's not enough doing. That restive, courageous, and stubborn morality which Ambassador Powers brings to the work that she does, that says we do have a role still in politics to impact people's lives and to save them. The rabbi invoked a little bit of Old Testament, so I will just briefly say it was Abraham when he became the chosen one, who one day was with his father, and the rabbis have made up a story around this, that at the time all the icons, the idols of the many gods were there. Having been chosen by God when his father left, he destroyed all of them but Yahweh, the one that was left. And his father came back very upset with him, saying, "What did you do? How could you destroy these and wreck them?" And he said, "I didn't do it. He did." And his father said, "Well, how could he do it? He's just an idol." And he said, "Well, isn't that the point, Father?" We need more iconoclasts, those who are willing to take the hammer and to smash the old ways of thinking that say that we are powerless in the face of gross abuses of human rights, of genocides and crime against humanity. I can think of no better person to deliver this year's Daniel Peril Lecture than someone who has embodied that, our ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Powers.
Thank you. Thank you, Mayor Garcetti, for your very kind words and for welcoming me and my husband, who's here with me, Cass Sunstein, to Los Angeles. I did my homework on the mayor before coming to his town, your town, and I came across something wonderful that he said about getting to be mayor of this remarkable city. He said, "You do this job right, you become more of an idealist." And I've got to say, I feel exactly the same way about the job that I'm privileged to have, my dream job, to get to go to work every day and sit in front of the placard that says the United States. I would like to offer up one of my friend and close colleague, Secretary of State John Kerry's favorite lines, "Let's get caught trying." We have to get caught trying. And I think that's what the mayor is doing already, and it's pretty wonderful to see. And word is out in New York City. You know, we got a race to the top between two great new mayors. To the rest of you, to all of you, let me say I'm delighted to be here and really honored to participate in this unique lecture series. First, let me express my appreciation to the Daniel Peril Foundation and to Hillel at UCLA for inviting me, and to the Burkle Center for International Relations, and Cal, great moderator. I say that until he starts asking me questions, then I'm sure he becomes less of a great moderator, but thank you for hosting us today. And I want to thank all of you, even though I can't fully see you with the lights, but I want to thank you all for showing up. especially the students. This is not an obvious place for you to be at 5 p.m. On a sunny Sunday in Los Angeles. But I suspect you've turned out here for this lecture for the very same reason that I've turned out, because of the person for whom this lecture series is named. I did not have the privilege of knowing Daniel Peril, but I know from all of my former journalistic colleagues who did, that he had an incredible empathy for others and an intense desire to learn. Qualities that he inherited from his parents, Ruth Peril, and UCLA's own Professor Judea Peril, who, as you know, are here with us tonight. And I wonder if we could just have a round of applause and thank Ruth and Judea for giving the world Danny Peril. And thank you also for making sure that we never forget him or what he stood for. I think their son would be very proud that the foundation established in his memory is dedicated to intercultural understanding. Given the circumstances of Danny's death, we should recognize how remarkable that is. Much of the world's sorrow can be traced to cycles of retribution where one group seeks revenge for real or imagined wrongs done by another. Individuals become symbols, faiths become enemies, and hate becomes a currency of identity, all that we have in common as fellow parents, fellow students, fellow believers, becomes reduced to a catastrophic alchemy of us versus them. That was the ugly mindset of the men who murdered Daniel Peril, because he was a reporter, an American, and most of all, because he was a Jew. In that infamous video, the killers advertised their ruthlessness, betrayed their faith, and sought further to inflame passions that divide the world. Not long thereafter, the Daniel Peril Foundation took its brave stand on the opposite shore, guiding us toward a more profound response to hate, urging dialogue, shared learning, reconciliation, and a recognition that individual, not collective, accountability is required to break cycles of violence. That journey need not be an arduous one. Among the magnetic attributes of Daniel Peril was his love of music. Wherever he went, he invited people to join him in performing. It is appropriate, therefore, that each year for the last decade, the foundation has sponsored the Daniel Peril World Music Days. These are events scheduled to coincide roughly with Daniel's birthday, and they are encouraged by U.S. embassies across the globe. They bring people together to play instruments ranging from the bongos and balalaika to the trombone and the harp, all the while communicating a message of mutual respect. Imagine the joyous sounds that can be produced, albeit not all at once, by a mixed ethnicity orchestra in Niger, a choral at a Catholic college in Sudan, a Muslim-Malay combo in Singapore, and a school band for children with disabilities in one of the poorest parts of Brazil. Each year, well over 1,000 concerts are conducted in some 80 countries, all to honor a writer of serious purpose who never forgot how to smile. Just as music was close to Daniel Peril's mighty heart, so too was the pursuit of truth. As a journalist down to his toes, he was driven to uncover and report facts. Nothing more, but also nothing less. He didn't seek out facts that would reinforce his own opinions about history or about justice. He instead tried to put together a puzzle, to assemble all the pieces so as to be able to vouch for one simple thing. What I am writing today really happened. This was true. This afternoon, as we remember Danny Peril, I would like to discuss the global peril faced by journalists, the critical importance the United States government attaches to protecting and promoting the rights of the media, and the duty of open government and open society to ensure access to information so as to enhance citizen understanding and strengthen the extent to which governments are accountable to their people. My remarks today are grounded in the simple wisdom of Louis Brandeis's great observation that sunlight is the best of disinfectants. Living in America, we may take the idea of a free press somewhat for granted, even as we lose patience with some in the media, and as we fall prey sometimes to writing off the whole enterprise as superficial or herd-like. We know deep down just how rigorous and professionalism journalism can still be. Each day, we have access to a wealth of information and a wealth of commentary. And we should never take for granted what we have here or how much our society benefits. Shockingly, according to Freedom House, only 1 person in 6 lives in a country where the press can be described as free. Today, here at home and all around the world, because of technology and the rising volume of voices from the grassroots, the struggle is intense to control information and to shape perceptions about what is true. In a healthy democracy, that is attempted through open debate. Those who are governing, like myself, might say one thing. The critics might claim another. Social networks have the chance to weigh in, and ultimately, voters have their say. But many governments lack confidence in their own legitimacy or in the credibility of their policies. So what do? They try to rig the game. Terrified of sunlight, they try to corrupt, intimidate, and manipulate the press. Some governments ensure control of the media through bribery and the awarding of lucrative contracts. Some require that reporters, newspapers, and broadcasters obtain licenses that are then parceled out only to friends and to people compliant enough to censor themselves. Some impose strict limitations on the internet and social networks. Some enact laws that equate criticism of government with support for subversion, treason, or terror. Some use officially controlled news outlets to smear the reputations of independent journalists, often accusing them of working for a foreign power. And some employ intermediaries to harass and beat up opposition editors and reporters. Let me offer a few examples. China continues its efforts to control the free flow of information using traditional tools of censorship and punishment, along with new ones to control the internet. In September, a reporter named Liu Hu was arrested for defamation after urging authorities to investigate a local official who had lost millions of yuan while overseeing the suspicious privatization of 2 state-owned companies. Liu's posts were later removed and his microblog accounts shut down without explanation. Following the publication of stories on the vast wealth accumulated by families of Chinese leaders, the New York Times faces challenges getting visas for its journalists. As a result, other journalists now worry that their coverage may lead to problems for themselves and their organizations, a recipe for self-censorship. And China, of course, is not the only egregious example. In Egypt, each day, when editors sit down to assign articles and design their front pages, they must first ask themselves how the government and military will react. In recent months, the authorities have lashed out at media thought to be sympathetic to the outlawed Muslim Brotherhood. They even videotaped the arrest of 2 Al Jazeera correspondents and then allowed a TV station to circulate the footage accompanied by music from the movie Thor: The Dark World. This is truly a theater of the absurd. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, the Egyptian government has arrested and detained over 60 journalists, both Egyptian and foreign, since this past summer. Approximately a dozen remain incarcerated. In nearby Ethiopia, Eskinder Nega continued to work online even after his license to publish was lifted and his newspaper closed. In 2011, though, he was arrested for protesting the arrest of other journalists under a sweeping new law. Mr. Nega has a 9-year-old son who will be 25 when his father completes his jail sentence, all because of a blog. And Turkey, despite being a NATO ally and a partner on key issues like Syria's humanitarian catastrophe, has the dubious distinction of remaining the world's #1 jailer of journalists in 2013, according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. From Eritrea and Iran to Ukraine and Venezuela, there are many comparable stories. The good news is that fewer journalists were in prison last year than had been the case in 2012. The bad news is that except for 2012, last year was the worst on record. By December's end, more than 200 reporters were incarcerated, and 105 had been killed while doing their jobs, the second highest number of journalists killed in a single year in recorded history. Many journalists who are attacked are investigative reporters, professional snoopers who are reluctant to accept empty assurances and instead probe deeply in search of illicit connections among the criminal, the corrupt, the inept, and the extreme. In the words of one such reporter, to do journalism is to walk on an invisible line through a field strewn with explosives. War correspondents are, of course, risking their lives every day. 2 years and 1 day ago, the US-born reporter Marie Colvin died when shells fired by the Syrian military hit the makeshift news center in which she was working. This was during the 20th consecutive day of attacks on the rebel-held neighborhood of the city of Homs. Colvin, like other international journalists, was in the country illegally, having entered via a smuggler's route, climbing over walls in the night. She had spent much of her professional life in places of conflict, from the Balkans and Chechnya to Sri Lanka, where she had lost an eye to a grenade, and East Timor, where she refused to abandon a group of civilians during an enemy siege, thus saving their lives. Her final dispatch from Syria was written in what is locally known as the widow's basement, a place where women and children hid behind mattresses in an area surrounded and targeted by snipers. Colvin wrote, "The building I was staying in lost its upper floor to a rocket last Wednesday. On some streets, whole buildings have collapsed. All there is to see are shredded clothes, broken pots, and the shattered furniture of families destroyed. Few homes have diesel for the tin stoves they rely on for heat in the coldest winter that anyone can remember. Freezing rain fills potholes and snow drifts in through windows empty of glass. No shops are open, so families are sharing what they have." Marie Colvin's last verbal portrait about caring and sharing among the desperate was written in February 2012, but it was more than 700 days later, in fact, just this month, that the Syrian regime, after intense pressure from the United States and the rest of the world, finally agreed to start allowing limited amounts of food into the besieged old city of Homs. And as we all know, Homs is only one part of a humanitarian tragedy fed by the regime's denial of access for relief supplies. Marie Colvin fit the classic description of a war correspondent, but with foreign reporters banned by the Syrian government, the majority of reporting there is being done in homegrown ways, coming from local bloggers and picture takers whose content is picked up by live streaming sites and YouTube. Many of these fledgling truth tellers have paid with their lives, including 18-year-old Molhem Barakat, a freelance cameraman who died in December during an assault on Aleppo. Barakat had been a journalist for only about 6 months. He was so young that in his final tweet, he boasted about unlocking a new level in a computer racing game. Since the Syrian war began, at least 61 reporters have been killed, while dozens more are missing. On every continent, repressive governments are engaged in nothing less than a war on truth. Our job is to rouse ourselves and use every tool available to help truth survive and win that war. This is a responsibility that President Obama and those of us privileged to work in his administration take very seriously. Almost exactly 225 years ago, Thomas Jefferson wrote that freedom of the press is the best means of ensuring that all avenues of truth are open to individual citizens. That is why, he said, this freedom is often, as he put it, the first shut up by those who fear the investigation of their actions. One could draw a straight line from Jefferson's assertion to President Obama's statement in 2010 that, quote, "The loss of Daniel Peril was one of those moments that captured the world's imagination because it reminded us of how valuable a free press is, and that there are those who would go to any length to silence journalists around the world," end quote. Immediately after saying those words, the president signed into law the Daniel Pearl Freedom of the Press Act. This statute was that rarest of Washington creatures, a bipartisan effort approved by the House of Representatives overwhelmingly and by the Senate unanimously. In response to that law, and in keeping with President Obama's guidance to make sure that governments around the world know that American diplomats are watching how they treat their journalists, we have made support for press freedom one of the core and recurring themes of U.S. diplomacy. Each day, U.S. officials make known our backing for the right of people to speak, publish, broadcast, blog, tweet, and otherwise express themselves openly and without fear. In Iran, even as we search for a solution to the nuclear issue, we are speaking up for the right of the Iranian people to voice their opinions online and through social media, just as their leaders are now doing. We've also led the charge to defend internet freedom, organizing the Freedom Online Coalition, a cross-regional group of 21 governments, which helped pass a landmark resolution at the Human Rights Council affirming that rights offline must be protected online. And every day, working with partners through the Digital Defenders Partnership, we help to deliver emergency assistance to activists, bloggers, citizen journalists, and ordinary citizens who are harassed, threatened, or arrested for championing human rights and raising political issues online. Standing up on behalf of these issues, casting American sunlight on the persecution of the Fourth Estate, is in the U.S. national interest. We know that when journalists and citizen activists cast light on flawed government policies, those policies are more likely to change, and governance is more likely to improve. We have seen that happen in our own country time and time again. It is no coincidence, as Amartya Sen famously found, that no democracy with a free press has ever suffered a famine. But the war for truth cannot be won only with a free and open press. A society's responsibility to hold those who govern to account should not be delegated only to a professional class of overseers. That is why President Obama has recognized that our efforts to support advocates for democratic change must be broader and deeper, embracing the fundamental human impulse to know and understand, to speak out, and to act. A critical starting point is access to information. It wouldn't surprise anyone at a university to hear someone say that knowledge is power. But how quickly we forget the struggle that had to be waged in our own country to ensure that, in the words of President Lyndon Johnson, quote, "the people's right to know is cherished and guarded," end quote. He said these words in celebration of the end of a 20-year campaign to pass a Freedom of Information Act in the United States of America. We now promote this historic piece of legislation, but it came almost 40 years after a progressive era in which muckraking journalists first began to pry open the walls that shielded the public's eyes from the activities of those with political power. Now, in the era of town halls and Google Hangouts, we take for granted that citizens themselves can and should be able to ask questions of government, seek answers, and gain back a sense of their own power. Our struggle in the United States has been replayed in many parts of the world. In India, where the most far-reaching right to information law on earth was passed in 2005, citizens in rural areas had long complained that local officials were stealing the wages that these citizens were owed for labor that they had done on public works. Thanks to this landmark right to information law, rural citizens have been able to get access to official government spending data, and thus they're able to find out how much the government claimed it was paying local villagers. Now, in these rural villages which lack computers or advanced technologies, community leaders have improvised. They have taken this data that they have obtained through the right to information law, and they've actually painted it on the walls of community centers and schools so that the villagers can stop by and see what the government is saying about how much they've each been paid. When the citizens come by and they scrutinize the government claims, they become self-appointed public auditors. And when they see the glaring discrepancies between what they were said to have been paid and what they actually received, they've been able to call out local officials for fraud and corruption and to demand that the stolen money be found and be expended properly. They have found, and there are tens of thousands of cases like this, that money was said to have been spent on road projects when roads went unbuilt. They have found that school supplies that their children never saw materialize were budgeted for. And they have seen benefits alleged to have been paid to elderly people who had been told that they were not entitled to be pensioners. The link between information and citizens' ability to cross-check government claims and hold officials accountable is striking. And the Indian law is backed by stiff fines for government officials who withhold information. Over the years, the United States has made it a priority to promote access to information. By the last count, more than 90 countries have enacted some kind of FOIA law, and the vast majority of these have been introduced in the last 15 years. In 2011, President Obama joined with heads of state from Brazil and 6 other countries, as well as 9 civil society organizations to launch an open government partnership, now 63 countries strong, to foster transparency, enhance civil liberties, and encourage the passage of laws that guarantee freedom of information. As part of the partnership, the President deepened our own commitment to freedom of information and citizen participation with a series of new commitments to the American people, including the launch of an online petition platform that has had more than 10 million visitors, and a new initiative to bring unprecedented transparency to oil, gas, and mining revenues. Other participating countries have made more than 1,000 commitments to improve access to information, open up public data, and create new mechanisms for ensuring that citizens have visibility and input into how their government works. Of course, the measure of any initiative is not the commitments, but the follow-through. And the success of this effort, OGP, will turn on whether citizens are able to hold governments to their word. We know, too, that while citizens can be powerful agents of change, it often takes organized groups, civil society, to translate this latent potential into meaningful change. It is not coincidental that at the very same time that freedom of the press is under threat, governments around the world are cracking down on the groups on which journalists depend to make use of the facts that they provide. Within the past 5 years, literally dozens of countries have enacted new laws or regulations aimed at restricting the activities of civil society. We are working globally in partnership with friends to defend civil society against those who would curb its ability to function as an advocate for human dignity and an incubator of reform. In 2013 alone, we invested more than $500 million to strengthen the work of these civil society groups. Some of our initiatives in support of free expression and openness are highly public, others are more quiet, and some are both restrained and dramatic at the same time. In one recent example, the diverse makeup of the U.S. delegation to the Winter Olympics reflected both the grand achievements of our country's athletes and an eloquent response by President Obama to a Russian law denying free speech to those who believe in equal rights for LGBT persons. Before I close, I would like to come back to where I started, the importance of the media in telling the truth. The best journalists aren't in the profession because they expect to become famous or rich. Most fine reporters are the opposite of humble, but they are realistic, knowing that they have chosen to travel a hard road. They are pushed along by the desire to find answers, and the issues they choose are usually serious ones. We don't read about writers being threatened because of what they have to say about Justin Bieber's driving issues. The danger comes when a reporter tackles war, crime, corruption, the denial of human rights, and breaches of public faith, subjects that affect the lives of many people and the fate of whole countries. As Marion Peril, a journalist herself, has noted, one of the reasons that reporters dare to search for truth is that they have faith that if they stumble, or are jailed, or are killed, another human bloodhound will come along, pick up the scent, and follow the trail. Today, all over the world, there are writers who insist that you can murder the journalist, but you cannot kill the story. And it's important that this happen, that vital stories be picked up, and the truth come out, because when that takes place, it shows that targeting a reporter, an editor, or a blogger is an exercise in futility. a crime that won't accomplish a thing. The killer of Daniel Peril is in prison. But the overall confrontation between the quest for truth and the denial of reality is renewed each and every day. We live surrounded by information, but we know that there are still many voices silenced too soon and a multitude of stories that should be told that are never heard. This gives us plenty of work to do. And as Daniel Pearl's example should remind us, there is always something that each of us, each and every one of us, can accomplish. After all, defending freedom of the press is but one element of a larger struggle. Whether we are in a position in government or sitting in a classroom, whether we have access to a podium or just a smartphone, we have a duty to be advocates for honesty, openness, critical thinking, and the rights and dignity of every person. Daniel Peril was just a reporter doing his job as well as it could be done. That is all, and that is everything. The earth has circled the sun a dozen times since he was taken, but Danny's voice is still heard. His music lives on, and his example as a solver of puzzles and a seeker after truth inspires us, each in our own way, to pick up the trail where he left off and blaze one of our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You covered so many things, but I want to start off by asking you about Syria, which I think is on everyone's mind and I know has been a major issue for you. On Friday, you worked very hard to achieve a new resolution in the Security Council. Can you give us a sense of what's
Saturday.
changed?
It was yesterday.
Sorry, Saturday. Saturday.
Still fresh.
Still fresh, very, very much so. So what's changed and what can the outside world do? Other nations, NGOs, individuals, what can we do to make the situation on the ground a little bit better?
Let me say a word, if I could, about the situation in Syria. Just everybody has busy lives and there's a lot going on in the world and in our own country. It really is the most deplorable humanitarian situation on planet Earth today, and I think really the most horrific in a generation, at least. You have 9.3 million people who are desperately dependent on humanitarian assistance. 3 million of those people can't be reached. They're in hard-to-reach areas. And 250,000 are of the kind I described in my remarks this evening, such as those in the old city of Homs. They're literally besieged. They're encircled on all sides. And for the most part, the regime, but in a couple cases, extremist opposition forces are just not allowing convoys in. So you have this devastating scene of convoys being on one side of a sort of community boundary, as it were, an artificial boundary, and people inside who are starving to death. And indeed, in some cases, they have asked the permission of religious authorities to get a special dispensation to be able to eat cats and dogs, basically, because it's that bad. It's really, 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 really bad. So what we have tried to do is we have tried to work through the United Nations from the beginning of the conflict to press the regime to allow food into people who are that hungry. And we have had almost no success. And the key tool in this effort, of course, is those who back this regime, and we are not one of them, so our leverage is not that of Russia, Iran, and others. But we have seen in the contrast between the effort on chemical weapons, where our Russian colleagues invested themselves fully and have had significant effect on the Syrian regime, as yet insufficient because we have not completed that task, and it is a bit stalled at present. But the contrast between where those UN workers who are involved in the chemical weapons enterprise, between where they can go and are permitted to go and where the humanitarians can go, is night and day. And we just can't live in a universe where that's the case. So what finally happened yesterday is that Russia joined us in a Security Council resolution for the first time in 3 years, demanding humanitarian access to these besieged areas, condemning the use of these horrific weapons that have just started to be employed in the last quarter of last year, barrel bombs, which maim, they're just weapons of terror deliberately designed to harm civilians in crowded, populated areas, and demanding cross-border humanitarian access, which is something the Syrian regime has not allowed in various places, which could allow up to 1 million more people to be reached. I hesitate to trumpet this resolution because it's words. I mean, until we see meaningful implementation, until we see the parties who have joined this resolution finally, and again, we welcome the resolution, working behind the scenes to see it implemented on the back end, it is very hard to know whether it's going to make a difference for those people that I've mentioned. But it is significant that Russia joined on to the demands that I've just mentioned for the first time in the 3 years of the conflict. And we, are already pressing both the UN and all of the parties to kind of take advantage of the momentum out of yesterday's vote. So it was a hard negotiated resolution, and again, at least gives us a hook. And within 30 days, there's going to be a report back to the Council, and in the event of non-compliance, the Council, including Russia, has committed to take further steps. So that's also a means to put pressure on the parties. To your question about what people can do, I mean, again, it's a cliche here, but call your congressman. I mean, I think there's a lot of fatigue in this country. I think there's concern about the Arab Spring and how violent it is in certain quarters has become. We need to look at examples like Tunisia to also see the promise, I think, of still what's going on there. Even Libya, which is, of course, not progressing in the way that anybody would have desired, but nonetheless, you have a wildly pro-American population there, a deep desire for the democracy to take hold, and just the need for centralized security forces and so forth to take hold and disarm the militia who continue to disrupt events there. But Syria, I think, confuses people, and there's no question that the longer the conflict has drawn on, the more that we do have great reason to fear the emergence of terrorist groups and so forth there. But it is still the case that diplomacy can be made to work. American resources are being used to feed some of the people that I've mentioned, again, who are living in such desperate need. And so anything, even just on the resources side, that can be done to support the humanitarian efforts, these people, whatever about the regime's behavior or some of the extremist groups, most of the people living in Syria are people like you and me, just wanting to get up and go to work and live with their families, and they claim their rights for the sake of their children having those rights. And unfortunately, what has befallen them is truly devastating. So I think just support the administration in its efforts to engage diplomatically and to really push for the kind of progress that we need to see. And then if there's any support that can be offered on the humanitarian side, it would be desperately welcomed by those poor people.
Would you support prosecution of the top leadership by the International Criminal Court? And that could be both on the Syrian regime and perhaps on the rebel side.
Well, as you know, an International Criminal Court referral can only come about if there's a self-referral or if the Security Council is prepared to vote in that regard. And I mean, I've just described that it took 3 years to get a resolution merely demanding humanitarian access to besieged areas. So there's no question that given the presence of Russia on the council, that an ICC referral, is not something that could be obtained. I will say that in yesterday's resolution, which was, again, weeks in the making, really 3 years in the making, unfortunately, it does identify starvation as a method of warfare, as a war crime and so forth. So there's a hook in terms of a depiction of the crimes or an accurate accounting of the crimes. But I think what we've done as a government is invest in the collection of evidence through the Syrian Justice and Accountability Center and through other means, training of Syrian activists, whether bloggers or just ordinary citizens, so they know how to collect evidence and so forth. I mean, we know the day will come where the people who are the worst culprits in this conflict are going to be brought to justice. It has happened time and time again. I mean, it's happened. I just saw 3 Auschwitz guards arrested last week, I think. justice sometimes is slow, and it feels painfully slow to the people of Syria, but we are certainly in this for the long game, and there will be a mechanism at some point to punish certainly the worst perpetrators.
Great, thank you. Let me ask you about something completely different. So in California, and of course in the United States, LGBT rights have been, I think, a source of inspiration, incredible progress in many respects. But around the world, as you know well, that's not always the case. In some countries, there's been backsliding, continued oppression, repression. Is this an issue that you think within the UN system, either the United States, the Security Council, other UN bodies, can play an effective role at pushing forward? Or is this something where we risk backlash and we need to take a more gentle approach?
It's an excellent question, and it could not be more timely. Some of you have seen in the news two devastating, a word now I've used too many times, but this is sadly the state of parts of the world right now, but devastating new laws and news of new laws over the last 4 or 5 weeks. In Nigeria, they passed a law basically prohibiting same-sex unions. I mean, I don't mean just same-sex marriage, but any same-sex cohabitation or involvement or whatever. And not only is the law incredibly problematic, and we've all spoken out about it, but the way the law is being implemented, as you will see in your news, is lists of men being made and kind of hunted down in particularly rural areas of Nigeria. And so, this is really a horrific setback for the people of Nigeria, and there is a climate of real fear that has set in. Then, in the wake of that, the president of Uganda announced that he would be soon himself signing a similar law, an anti-homosexuality bill, as they call them. And so it is, there's a terrible divergence in a way of the journey that I think we are on in this country and some of the developments that we're seeing across the world, and not just in sub-Saharan Africa. This is a truly, a true crisis, really, that exists for LGBT persons in a large number of countries. To your question about what the United States can do about it or what the UN can do about it, I'd say a few things. First, President Obama issued the first ever presidential directive dedicated to making LGBT rights a central part of our international human rights agenda. And that has several dimensions to it. One, rapid reaction funds of the kind actually that I referenced also in relation to bloggers and so forth, but basically defenders funds, to pay for lawyers and others to take cases in judicial systems in the hopes of contesting some of these laws. And of course the judicial systems are often themselves not independent enough to contest what has been done by the legislature or by the executive. But nonetheless, contestation and support for those who are doing it around the world. Asylum, expedited asylum review for those who are being persecuted, whether under these laws or just by virtue of societal practice. And within the UN, we succeeded, in fact, before, this is now going on 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago, but getting the first ever measure through the Human Rights Council actually acknowledging that LGBT persons were entitled to universal human rights and to the fundamental human rights and protections. So, and that was, came right down to the wire and really created big divisions within governments and also among governments that normally were aligned. So, there are a lot of very well-meaning people across countries even that are passing these laws, but what used to be thinkable here and has become unthinkable is sadly too thinkable and too common, and there is great fear about sticking your head up in these countries and endangering your own life or your families and so forth. So there's a great fear out there. You put your finger on a challenge, which is if it's the United States, out there, is that going to be helpful? I think what we try to do is just retain really close contact with those who are on the front lines, ultimately those people who are the most imperiled, and ask their judgment. Would it be helpful to have a public statement from the President of the United States? Would it be helpful for our ambassador to go in? Where should our funds go when it comes to supporting groups? Is it better to have no funds from any outside government whatsoever? And so I think we try to be consequentialists. I mean, this is not about us expressing our values. That's important too, of course, but not if it's going to actually interfere with others or jeopardize others enjoying these rights themselves. So, but we deem them the best judge, really, of which tools in our toolbox we should employ at a given time.
Great, thank you. So we're sitting just a few hundred yards from Ralph Bunche Hall, where my office, Burkle Center offices are. And Ralph Bunche won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1950 for his work brokering the armistice between Israel and its Arab neighbors. In the years since, obviously, the climate within the United Nations has changed. Is that an issue that you think can be constructively addressed through UN processes today?
Well, I think we have, Secretary Kerry is investing a huge amount of energy, as everyone knows, in a peace process that is chugging along. Chug may not be the word everyone uses at given times, but forward progress. And I think it's also fair to say that many people, again, were very skeptical that the kinds of steps that have been taken up to this point would be taken, and I think it's really a tribute to the courage of the leaders of both parties involved in those talks. The way that Secretary engages that process is in very close consultation, both directly and through me, with the Secretary General, with the European Union, with Russia, and those countries in the region particularly, who will have great bearing on the success of any ultimate settlement. So I think for now, it's best to keep our eye on that process, a process in which, again, both leaders have taken great risks to engage in with the seriousness that they have so far. And on the back end of this process, I mean, there could be a great need for resources. There could be, it will really depend on the parties themselves and what they reach out for as a way of cementing any deal that gets done.
Great, thank you. Ambassador Power, I know you're on a very tight schedule, but I do think we have time for a couple of questions. And so for those of you in the audience, we have handheld mics, so please raise your hand and please keep your questions short and to the point. Let's start right here. Gentleman in the beige jacket. Do we have a microphone coming down? Why don't you stand up and project?
Thank you. The relationship between the United States and the UN. It's a contentious problem. There's a lot of sort of negative hyperbole in this country concerning the United Nations. I wonder if you could talk to how your role, particularly your skill set as a journalist, might come in useful in creating a better understanding of exactly how the US and the UN are supposed to interact.
Thank you.
Interesting. So, I struggle with this a little bit because certainly the way that President Obama and his national security team see the UN and talk about the UN is as a critical vehicle for promoting and protecting U.S. national interests. I don't dispute that is not a universally hailed view, which I can come back to. But I say that because everyone in this room and everyone across this country, I think, believes in, to state the obvious, the vaccination of children and the eradication of polio. It is the UN through the World Health Organization and through UNICEF that is out there doing that in those parts of the world where national health systems on their own are not able to do it. There's no one in this country, I think, that welcomed the fact that Al-Qaeda affiliated groups had taken over 2/3 of Mali a year plus ago, nor would they dispute that it's very much in the US's national interest that those Al-Qaeda forces were beaten back in the first instance by France and the African Union, and then that the United Nations has sent in so far 6,000, soon to be 11 or 12,000 peacekeepers to work with the Malian forces who need to be strengthened to control that territory and prevent a safe haven from being created yet again, because Lord knows armed groups don't give up that easily, and I'm sure there'll be efforts to take back territory that was lost and to terrorize civilians. Those are just a couple examples, helping shepherd the birth of the new country of South Sudan. That was something done a couple years ago. Now, as South Sudan has descended, unfortunately, into terrible ethnic violence over the last months, UN peacekeepers were present on the ground. One of the things the UN is not known for is its speed. It kind of aggregates the slowness of 193 governments, because the US government is also not known for its speed either. But it's made great headway in that regard. And when this crisis took hold and the ethnically motivated killing started, the Secretary General, really in an unprecedented act, recognizing he couldn't build a new peacekeeping mission dedicated to civilian protection overnight, because it takes time to, get countries to, because it's all about which countries will contribute what. He decided to draw on other missions across sub-Saharan Africa and literally pull units that were serving in peacekeeping missions, let's say in Darfur or in Congo or elsewhere, and pull them into South Sudan so that there'd be more patrols and civilians who are huddled at UN bases, desperate with their children, with their families, desperate for UN protection, would have a more substantial UN presence. So, and that's something, again, if you look at college campuses, and I think including this one, and even high schools around the country, the interest in Sudan and in preventing atrocities and in protecting civilians, is really extensive. And so, again, these are just anecdotes. In Iraq and Afghanistan, places where, in Iraq, of course, we've pulled our troops out entirely. In Afghanistan, we're drawing down. It's UN political missions that are there, helping sponsor elections, helping work with civil society, protect women's rights, report on abuses, try to deal with some of the corruption issues, et cetera. So it is so centrally a part of our national security interests and out of our foreign policy every day that your question kind of took me back to, I feel like, a sort of bygone age. And I think if you look at the Bush administration, which at different times had some strong words for the UN, and ambassadors who had maybe a slightly different view of the UN than I might, I will grant. But they too, certainly in the second term of the Bush administration, you see more and more of a work with and through the peace and security side of the UN system. Recognition that, for instance, the elections in Iraq, the famous purple finger, that was, again, something before our administration came into office, but something that the United States government, the Bush administration, and the UN worked on centrally. So, really, I think, to your point about what can a former journalist, has-been journalist like me, offer in this regard, I just, one of the great lines in journalism is show, don't tell. I think if you say, the UN is in the US interests and then leave it at that, it just, people have maybe, preconceptions and so forth. You just need to pry it apart and talk functionally about all the things that we're doing together, and I think that would really appeal to the American people. Now, that doesn't mean, again, that we're in any way complacent about the slowness, the cost, some of the mismanagement issues and so forth, and we were driving on those issues incredibly hard every day. That's one of the core priorities for me in my time. And in fact, by virtue of having, I think, a strong relationship to the UN and wanting a stronger and more effective UN, we have a lot of credibility from which also to push for reform, which is what we are doing. Whether that's in making them post their audits up online, some of the things I was talking about in terms of open government, that should be applying to the United Nations as well. A lot of the books are closed, and there's not nearly as much accountability as we need to see both as a government who wishes them to use their money wisely for the sake of good causes, but also as the custodians of the American taxpayer and the resources that we invest in the organization. But it's not just on the financial side, it's also on the performance side. Again, we will be better off, the United States will be better off, our interests will be advanced if UN peacekeeping is more effective, if it is quicker, if it has mobility and an ability for, and troops that come in with the equipment and the training they need to really protect people. So we're invested on the performance side as much as on the efficiency side.
I really want to encourage UCLA students. So I think I see a student, someone who resembles a student over here. Go, you're it. Go ahead, stand up.
Congratulations if you're not a student and have just been.
I am a student. I'm really excited to speak with you, Ambassador Power. My question is about a resolution that our undergraduate student government will be considering this Tuesday, which will call for this university to divest from certain companies that profit or are involved in the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. So I was wondering if you had any comments on the efficacy of a divestment approach to resolving this conflict.
I guess I'd say a couple things. First, we oppose boycotts and divestments and do not feel as if they are appropriate in this context at all, but also feel that they are disruptive to the most lasting way to bring about dignity and peace for both parties involved, which is this peace process that we have underway, that really does stand a meaningful chance of achieving, again, security, peace, dignity, and ultimately prosperity as well for the Palestinian people as well as for the State of Israel. I think efforts at delegitimation are counterproductive. It's something we deal with at the United Nations a lot. And I'll just give you a couple examples of things that we have done just in the short time that I've been there. Every country in the United Nations belongs to a kind of regional group in which they do their work. We do our negotiating, we sort of caucus, it's like caucuses within the Senate. At the United Nations in New York, we have a little caucus that works on human rights issues. Let's say on South Sudan or on LGBT issues and so forth. Israel has been trying to become a member of that group for as long as that group has existed. And it's Israel's record of voting coincidence with those of us who are part of that group is higher than the United States' rate of voting coincidence with these other so-called like-minded. I mean, we're close, but Israel is completely like-minded with the countries in the group. Despite years of trying to get Israel into the group, it was excluded. And finally, 2 weeks ago, just again through relentless lobbying and through making a functional case for why it was in our interest to bring Israel into this conversation, and into this grouping, Israel was admitted. And this has been a priority of mine since I got there. Similarly, in Geneva, Israel had been, there's a regional group known as the Western European and Other Group. And yeah, you never want to be the other until you have no place else to go. And again, it's in all of our interests to bring Israel into the community of nations. It is completely anachronistic that all these years after the country's founding, it's literally like the kid in the corner who can't even find its way into a group, when at the same time it's sending medical doctors to Haiti in the wake of the earthquake. It's laying down resolutions in the General Assembly to try to alleviate poverty through entrepreneurship and through new technologies in agriculture, which Israel, of course, has a lot of experience on and has a lot to offer the rest of the world. So we are believers that integration is the best route, actually, to bring about peace and security and ultimately justice.
Ambassador Power, know I speak for everyone in thanking you for taking the time to come out here to meet with us, for your service, and for your willingness to do this lecture. We really appreciate it. Please
Thanks,
join me in
everybody.
thanking.
Thank you.